On Christmas Eve, 1945, a house in Fayetteville, West Virginia, caught fire in the middle of the night. A mother and father and 4 of their children made it out alive, but 5 of their children did not. When the fire department finally arrived the next morning, they searched the ashes for remains. They found coins. They found a burned dictionary, but they did not find a single bone. Not one. 5 children had vanished from a burning house, and in nearly 80 years, no one has ever been able to explain what happened to them. George Sodder was born Giorgio Soddu in 1895 on the island of Sardinia, Italy. He came to America in 1908 when he was 13 years old, alone with almost nothing. He settled in West Virginia, taught himself English, and built a trucking business from scratch. By his mid-40s, George had married a woman named Jennie, and together they had 10 children. He was loud, opinionated, proud of his adopted country, and fiercely protective of his family. He kept a ladder propped against the side of the house at all times, just in case anyone ever needed to climb out of a second-story window in an emergency. The Sodder family lived in a large wooden house on a hillside just outside Vella. It was the kind of home that was always noisy, always full, always alive. On Christmas Eve of 1945, 9 of the 10 children were home. The oldest, Joe, was away serving in the Army. The rest ranged from 2-year-old Sylvia, the baby, all the way up to 23-year-old John. And so that evening the house was buzzing the way it always was before Christmas. The younger kids, Maurice, who was 14, Martha, who was 12, Louis, who was 9, Jennie, who was 8, and little Betty, who had just turned 5, were too excited to sleep. Jennie Sodder, their mother, had spent the day cooking. George had been hauling coal. By midnight, the parents and the 4 oldest children had gone to bed, but the 5 younger ones were still awake upstairs, playing with the toys and games they'd gotten for Christmas. The phone rang around 12:30 in the morning. Jennie answered it. A woman's voice she didn't recognize asked for a name she didn't know. Jennie could hear laughter and clinking glasses in the background, like a party. She told the woman she had the wrong number and hung up. She noticed the lights were still on upstairs and the front door was unlocked, but she was too tired to go check on the kids. She went back to bed, but this is where things start to go wrong in ways that still don't make sense 80 years later. Because what happened over the next few hours wasn't just a house fire. It was a sequence of events so perfectly orchestrated that George and Jennie Sodder would spend the rest of their lives convinced that someone had taken their children. And the evidence, as disturbing as it is, suggests they might have been right, because in October of 1945, just 2 months before the fire, a life insurance salesman had come to the house. When George refused to buy a policy, the man pointed at the house and said, "This is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." He said it was because of the dirty remarks George had been making about Mussolini. At around 1 in the morning on Christmas Day, Jennie Sodder woke up to the smell of smoke. She ran downstairs and saw flames consuming George's office near the front of the house. She tried to call the fire department, but the phone was dead, not damaged by fire. The line had been cut. George scrambled to get the children out. He, Jennie, and 4 of the kids, Marion, John, George Jr., and baby Sylvia, made it outside. But the 5 younger children were still upstairs. The staircase was already engulfed. Therefore, George ran to the side of the house where he always kept a ladder propped against the wall. It was gone. The ladder that had been there for years, the one he kept specifically for emergencies, had vanished. He ran to his 2 coal trucks, thinking he could back one up to the house and climb onto the roof. Neither truck would start. Both had worked perfectly the day before. George tried to re-enter the house through a window, slicing his arm open on the glass, but the heat was too intense. He stood in the yard in his bare feet, in the snow, watching his house burn, screaming the names of his 5 children. The Fayetteville Fire Department did not arrive until 8 o'clock the next morning, 7 hours after the fire started. By then, the house had burned to its foundation. The fire chief told George and Jennie that their children's remains had been consumed by the flames. But that explanation didn't sit right with George, because he knew something that the fire chief apparently didn't. A house fire does not burn hot enough to destroy human bone. Not even close. And when George searched the ashes himself, he found melted coins, appliances, and a partially burned dictionary. But no bones, no teeth, nothing. The state fire marshal ruled the cause as faulty wiring. Case closed. But George Sodder wasn't a man who gave up. He and Jennie began investigating on their own, and what they found made the official explanation collapse. First, they located a bus driver who had been driving through Fayetteville late on Christmas Eve. He told them he had seen people throwing what looked like balls of fire onto the roof of the Sodder house from the road. He could describe the trajectory. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. But that wasn't even the most disturbing detail. A woman at a hotel 50 miles away came forward and said that on Christmas morning she had seen the 5 Sodder children in the company of 2 men and 2 women she didn't recognize. She described each child accurately, down to their clothing. The group had Italian accents. Therefore, George became convinced this wasn't a fire at all. It was a kidnapping, staged to look like a tragedy. Someone had cut the phone lines, removed the ladder, disabled the trucks, set the fire, and removed the children before the flames spread. The insurance salesman's threat about Mussolini echoed in his mind constantly. And this is where the story gets even darker. George had been publicly and loudly critical of Benito Mussolini during World War II. He was one of the few Italian immigrants in the region who openly condemned fascism. In a small coal mining town with a significant Italian population, not everyone appreciated that. The theory that emerged, and the one George believed until his death, was that his children had been taken by members of the Sicilian mafia as retaliation for his political views. In 1949, George hired a Washington, D.C. pathologist named Oscar Hunter to excavate the fire site. The dig was thorough, going several feet into the earth. They found more coins, more household objects, and a few small bone fragments. Hunter examined them and determined they were vertebrae, but not from children. They were from an animal, likely a calf. Someone had planted them. George and Jennie erected a billboard along Route 21 near the fire site. It displayed photos of all 5 children, offered a reward of $10,000, and asked a single question: what happened to our children? That billboard stood for decades. It became one of the most haunting roadside landmarks in West Virginia. But the most chilling moment came in 1968, 23 years after the fire. Jennie Sodder walked to her mailbox and found an envelope with no return address, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a young man in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair and features that Jennie recognized immediately. He looked exactly like her son Louis would have looked at that age. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 3 words: Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Lil boys, a 90132 or 35. Jennie's hands were shaking. She and George hired a private detective and sent him to Central City, Kentucky, to find whoever had mailed the photo. The detective arrived, checked into a hotel, and was never heard from again. He vanished completely. George and Jennie never learned who sent the photograph. George Sodder died in 1969, 1 year after receiving the photograph of the man who looked like Louis. He was 74 years old. He spent the last 24 years of his life searching for his 5 children, and he died without answers. Jennie kept searching. She maintained the billboard. She answered letters from people who claimed to have information. She followed every lead, no matter how unlikely. She died in 1989, at the age of 80, still believing her children were alive somewhere. And here is what makes this case impossible to let go of. Fire investigators, both at the time and in the decades since, have confirmed that a standard house fire burning wood and household materials does not reach temperature sufficient to completely destroy human remains. Exposed bones can survive temperatures of over 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. The Sodder fire was not an industrial furnace. It was a 2-story wooden house that burned for approximately 45 minutes before the roof collapsed. 5 children cannot simply vanish into ash. The absence of any remains, no bones, no teeth, no skull fragments, in a fire that preserved coins and a dictionary, has never been explained by any fire expert. Not once. Not in 80 years. The phone lines were cut. The ladder was removed. The trucks were sabotaged. A bus driver saw people throwing incendiary devices onto the roof. And a woman at a hotel 50 miles away described seeing the 5 children with strangers on Christmas morning. And 23 years later, a photograph arrived that looked exactly like one of the missing boys. Every piece of evidence points in the same direction, but no one has ever proven what happened. The billboard stood on Route 21 for over 50 years. When the property was eventually sold, the new owners took it down. There is nothing marking the site today. Maurice Sodder would be 94 years old now. Martha would be 92. Louis would be 90. Jennie would be 88. Betty would be 85. If any of them survived that Christmas Eve, they would have lived entire lives, possibly under different names, possibly never knowing what happened to their parents or their siblings who escaped the fire. Sylvia Sodder, the baby who was carried out of the burning house at 2 years old, grew up to become the family's most dedicated investigator. She spent decades trying to find her brothers and sisters. She collected documents, followed leads, and gave interviews well into her 70s. She died in 2021 at the age of 79. She never found them, but she never stopped believing they were out there. The case remains officially open. The Fayette County Sheriff's Office has never closed it. No suspect has ever been named. No remains have ever been found. No one has ever come forward to say they were one of the 5 missing Sodder children. And somewhere, in a filing cabinet in West Virginia, there is still a photograph of a dark-haired man who looks exactly like Louis Sodder. No one knows who he is, and no one ever found the detective who went looking for him.